May 16, 1811. Southern Spain. Colonel William Ingram Myers stood on a low ridge southeast of the village of Albuera, watching 8,000 French infantry surge toward his exposed flank like a dark tide. Behind him, 6,000 British soldiers, most of them raw recruits who'd never fired a shot in anger, were still facing the wrong direction. In perhaps 15 minutes, Marshal Soult's entire army would smash into their vulnerable side and roll up the Allied line like a carpet. Myers had two choices, both catastrophic: turn his brigade to meet the French and expose his men to murderous fire during the maneuver, or hold position and be annihilated from the flank. Either way, most of his men would die. Either way, the French would likely break through, destroy the Allied army, and march unopposed to relieve the vital fortress of Badajoz. The entire Peninsular War, Britain's only military effort against Napoleon's empire, hung on whatever happened in the next 60 seconds. This was the most desperate situation British forces would face during the entire 6-year campaign in Spain and Portugal. By the end of this day, more British soldiers would die per capita than at Waterloo, than at any other battle Wellington's army ever fought. The 57th Regiment of Foot would suffer 428 casualties out of 570 men, a 75% casualty rate that remains the highest ever recorded by a British infantry regiment in a single day. Bodies would lie so thick across one section of ridge that survivors couldn't walk without stepping on corpses. An entire brigade would effectively cease to exist as a fighting formation, and yet, impossibly, those 6,000 men would hold. They would break the Grande Armée's finest infantry. They would save Spain from reconquest. They would achieve something military historians still struggle to fully explain. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Albuera was more than just another Peninsular War battle. You'll see how a handful of regiments, many filled with teenagers who'd enlisted months earlier to escape poverty, stood against Napoleon's most experienced veterans in conditions so hellish that hardened soldiers wept recounting them decades later. You'll discover why this battle, somehow forgotten by everyone except military historians and regimental museums, represents something essential about what humans can endure when everything depends on it. But we can't just jump straight to that blood-soaked ridge. Without understanding the context, the strategic situation, the commanders, the stakes, the armies, the terrain, you can't grasp why Albuera mattered so much, or why its outcome seemed so impossible. In May 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled virtually all of Europe. From the Atlantic to the borders of Russia, from the North Sea to southern Italy, his empire and its satellites dominated the continent. The Grande Armée had crushed every major European power. Austria defeated at Austerlitz and Wagram. Prussia annihilated at Jena. Russia fought to a draw at Friedland and forced into alliance. Britain, Napoleon's most intractable enemy, stood isolated, unable to field armies large enough to challenge French dominance, reduced to naval supremacy and peripheral operations. Except in one place, the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was supposed to be easy. In 1807, Napoleon had manipulated the Spanish monarchy into allowing French troops passage to invade Portugal, Britain's last continental ally. In 1808, he deposed the Spanish royal family and installed his brother Joseph as King of Spain. The Spanish regular army collapsed quickly. By any conventional measure, Spain should have become another French satellite within months. Instead, it became what Napoleon himself called the Spanish ulcer, a wound that bled his empire white. The Spanish people rose in spontaneous revolt. Guerrilla warfare erupted across the country. British forces, initially evacuated after defeat at Corunna, returned to Portugal and gradually pushed into Spain. By 1811, over 300,000 French troops were tied down in Iberia, troops Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. Marshal after marshal had tried and failed to pacify the peninsula. Armies that had marched triumphantly across Europe found themselves ambushed, starved, and worn down by an enemy they couldn't bring to decisive battle. The strategic key to the entire theater lay in the fortresses controlling the routes between Portugal and Spain. Portugal had become Britain's secure base. The Royal Navy supplied Lisbon, and British forces under General Arthur Wellesley, soon to be ennobled as Viscount Wellington, had defeated 2 French invasions. But to advance into Spain and potentially drive the French out entirely, the British needed to control the fortress cities that guarded the frontier: Ciudad Rodrigo in the north and Badajoz in the south. In early 1811, Badajoz had fallen to the French after a determined siege. This fortress city, built on a hill overlooking the Guadiana River, controlled the southern invasion route between Portugal and Spain. Its capture gave the French a secure base and threatened British supply lines. If they could hold it, they could use it as a springboard for another invasion of Portugal. If the British could retake it, they could advance deep into southern Spain. Wellington understood this perfectly. In May 1811, he dispatched a force under Marshal William Beresford, a capable if unspectacular British officer, commanding both British and Portuguese troops, to besiege Badajoz and retake it before the French could fortify it properly. Beresford arrived with approximately 35,000 Allied soldiers, British, Portuguese, and Spanish, and began siege operations. The French response was predictable and formidable. Marshal Jean de Dieu Soult, commanding French forces in Andalusia, had to relieve Badajoz. If he allowed it to fall without a fight, the entire French position in southern Spain would collapse. Soult was one of Napoleon's most capable marshals, experienced, aggressive, and commanding veteran troops who'd fought across Europe. He assembled an army of approximately 24,000 men and marched north to raise the siege. The mathematics were brutal for Beresford. He couldn't maintain the siege and fight Soult simultaneously. He had to lift the siege, concentrate his forces, and meet Soult in open battle. The location he chose was a low ridge near the village of Albuera, about 20 miles south of Badajoz, where the terrain gave defensive advantages and where his allied army, a mixture of British, Portuguese, and Spanish troops with varying levels of training and experience, could block the French advance. On May 15th, both armies maneuvered into position. The battle would begin the next morning. For Beresford, the stakes couldn't be higher. Defeat meant the siege abandoned, Badajoz secured for France, and possibly the loss of southern Portugal. For Soult, success meant relieving Badajoz, destroying a significant Allied army, and potentially knocking the British out of southern Spain entirely. The soldiers on both sides understood what was coming. Veterans had that hollow feeling in their stomachs that comes before a major battle. The raw recruits, and there were many in the British regiments, tried to sleep, cleaned their muskets compulsively, wrote letters they hoped wouldn't become their last. Officers checked ammunition supplies and sharpened swords. Surgeons prepared their instruments, knowing they'd soon be working by candlelight with screaming men held down on blood-slicked tables. And that's exactly what terrified everyone who understood military affairs. This would be a collision between 2 armies that couldn't afford to lose, fought with the brutal close-quarters tactics of Napoleonic warfare, on terrain that offered limited room for maneuver. It would be a slugging match, decided by which infantry could endure more punishment and keep fighting. The casualty rates would be catastrophic. There was one man who approached the coming battle with more dread than determination: William Beresford, the Allied commander. And this matters enormously to understanding what happened at Albuera, because the battle would be won not by brilliant generalship, but by the raw courage of soldiers fighting despite inadequate leadership. Beresford was an unusual figure. Born illegitimate in 1768 to the first Marquis of Waterford, he'd joined the British Army at 16 and risen through a combination of competence, connections, and sheer persistence. He was physically imposing, tall, powerfully built with a commanding presence, and had lost an eye in a shooting accident which gave him a somewhat intimidating appearance. He'd served in multiple campaigns: Egypt, South America, and for the past 3 years, Portugal. His real talent lay in administration and training, not battlefield command. Wellington had placed him in charge of reorganizing the Portuguese army, and Beresford had excelled at this task. He'd taken dispirited, poorly equipped Portuguese troops and transformed them into a reliable force capable of standing alongside British regulars. He was methodical, hard-working, and absolutely loyal to Wellington. He understood logistics, drill, and military administration. What he lacked was battlefield instinct, that intuitive grasp of fluid tactical situations that separates competent officers from great commanders. Beresford followed procedures, stuck to plans, and struggled to adapt when circumstances changed rapidly. He was, in modern terms, an excellent staff officer, promoted beyond his optimal level. Wellington knew this, but had limited options. There weren't enough experienced British generals in the peninsula, and Beresford's seniority and administrative record made him the logical choice for independent command. By May 1811, Beresford had concluded that Badajoz must be retaken to secure the Allied position in Spain. He'd invested enormous effort in the siege, bringing up heavy artillery, organizing supply lines, and coordinating his disparate Allied force. The approach of Soult's army forced him into a situation he dreaded, a major pitched battle where he'd command not just Portuguese troops he knew well, but also British and Spanish units, against one of Napoleon's finest marshals. The night before the battle, Beresford was visibly anxious. Multiple witnesses recorded his nervous energy, his constant questions to subordinates, his changes to the deployment plan. He knew the terrain was imperfect. The ridge he'd chosen was low, the flanks were vulnerable, visibility was limited. He knew his army was a polyglot force with coordination challenges. He knew Soult was a more experienced battle commander. And he knew Wellington expected him to hold the line until reinforcements could arrive. What Beresford couldn't know, what no one could know, was that his tactical uncertainty would create the conditions for one of the most desperate fights in military history. His initial deployment would be wrong. His response to French maneuvers would be slow. His command decisions during the battle would be, charitably, inadequate. And yet his army would win anyway, through the extraordinary courage and discipline of soldiers who refused to break even when their commanders failed them. To understand what made Albuera so remarkable, you need to grasp the stark differences between the armies that would collide on that ridge. Marshal Soult commanded approximately 24,000 men, organized into experienced French divisions. These weren't raw conscripts. Most had fought in multiple campaigns across Europe. They'd marched from Germany to Spain, seen action in numerous battles, and learned to trust their officers and their tactics. French infantry doctrine emphasized the ordre mixte, a flexible system combining line and column formations that allowed rapid maneuver and concentrated firepower at the decisive point. French artillery was among the best in Europe, and their cavalry included tough, battle-hardened dragoons. Soult himself was 52 years old, a marshal since 1804, and one of Napoleon's most trusted subordinates. He'd commanded corps at Austerlitz, fought in Prussia and Poland, and spent 3 years in Spain learning the peculiarities of peninsular warfare. He was aggressive, tactically proficient, and utterly ruthless when necessary. His plan for Albuera would be characteristically bold. Pin the Allied center with a feint while swinging his main force around the Allied right flank to smash into their vulnerable side. If executed properly, it would roll up the Allied line and destroy Beresford's army in a matter of hours. The Allied army was a different proposition entirely. Beresford commanded roughly 35,000 men on paper, but the force was dramatically uneven in quality and experience. The Spanish contingent, under General Joaquin Blake, numbered about 12,000 men. Spanish troops were motivated, fighting for their homeland against foreign invaders, but poorly equipped, irregularly paid, and still recovering from years of defeats. Their officers ranged from competent to barely adequate. Most critically, Spanish formations had limited experience operating alongside British and Portuguese units. Language barriers complicated coordination. Spanish military doctrine differed from British practices. Blake himself was brave, but had a mixed record in independent command. The Portuguese troops, roughly 10,000 strong, were Beresford's own creation. He'd spent years training them, and they'd proven themselves in previous engagements. They used British drill, carried British muskets, and were often led by British officers. They were reliable, disciplined, and capable of standing in line under fire, a critical quality in Napoleonic warfare. They would perform admirably at Albuera. The British contingent numbered approximately 7,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. And here's where the situation becomes truly interesting. Many of these soldiers were green recruits. Britain in 1811 faced a perpetual manpower problem. The Royal Navy consumed tens of thousands of sailors. The expanding war in Spain required constant reinforcements. Recruitment struggled to keep pace with casualties and disease. As a result, the British regiments at Albuera included many soldiers who'd enlisted within the past year, some who'd been in Spain only a few months, and quite a few who'd never experienced battle. Consider the 57th Regiment of Foot, which would bear the heaviest casualties. This regiment had been reinforced with drafts from militia units and new recruits. Many were teenagers from industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, London, who'd joined to escape poverty or unemployment. They'd had basic drill training but limited campaign experience. They could load and fire their muskets, the Brown Bess smoothbore, effective to about 100 yards, but they'd never stood in line, while cannonballs tore through their ranks or faced a bayonet charge from veteran French infantry. The same was true for much of the British force. Yes, there were veteran battalions, but many regiments were below strength and filled out with untested men. The officers ranged from experienced to barely competent. The British system of purchasing commissions meant wealth often mattered more than ability, though combat had a way of sorting out the incompetent quickly. What the British did have was drill. Endless, mind-numbing drill. British infantry training emphasized rapid, controlled musket fire, the famous thin red line tactic, where soldiers stood 2 ranks deep and delivered volleys with mechanical precision. A well-trained British battalion could fire 3 volleys per minute, far faster than most continental armies. This required iron discipline. Men had to stand unflinching while bullets whizzed past, reload calmly while comrades fell beside them, and maintain formation despite the overwhelming instinct to flee or seek cover. The theory was that superior fire discipline and higher rate of fire would allow outnumbered British infantry to defeat larger French formations. The 2-rank line maximized firepower. Every musket could engage the enemy. French infantry, typically in denser columns, could bring fewer muskets to bear but had greater shock power for close-quarters fighting and psychological impact. This tactical matchup had worked in previous battles. At Vimero, at Talavera, at Busaco. British infantry in line would halt French columns with devastating volleys, then counterattack with the bayonet. But those battles had been fought under Wellington's direct command, on carefully chosen ground, with the British regiments properly positioned and led. At Albuera, circumstances would be different. The British would be caught redeploying under fire, would lose formation, would find themselves in a killing match with no room for tactical finesse. The question wasn't whether British drill could defeat French élan in ideal conditions. The question was whether inexperienced soldiers could maintain discipline in absolute hell. The battlefield of Albuera was deceptively simple. The village itself lay in a shallow valley with a small stream, the Albuera brook, running past it. Southeast of the village, a low ridge rose gradually, running roughly north-south. This ridge became the key terrain feature of the battle. The ridge wasn't dramatic, perhaps 30 to 50 feet of elevation, sloping gently on both sides, but it offered the crucial advantage of high ground. Troops positioned on the ridge could fire down on attackers and had better visibility. The slope wasn't steep enough to prevent artillery deployment, but was sufficient to make attacking uphill genuinely difficult. Beresford deployed his army with the village of Albuera on his left, northern flank, his center extending along the ridge, and his right flank anchored on higher ground to the southeast. The Albuera brook provided a minor obstacle to any French advance from the east. Roads ran through the village toward Badajoz in the north and toward Seville in the south. Control of these roads meant control of supply and communication lines. The ground was relatively open, with scattered olive groves and low vegetation but few major obstructions. This meant limited cover for infantry and excellent terrain for cavalry operations. It also meant that once battle was joined, there would be little opportunity for either side to break contact. The armies would be locked in combat until one side broke. Weather would play a critical role. May 16th dawned with heavy clouds and occasional rain showers. By mid-morning, rain would turn the battlefield into mud, affecting movement and making musket fire less reliable. Wet gunpowder meant misfires increased dramatically. The weather also limited visibility, creating fog and smoke that made command and control even more challenging. The tactical problem for Beresford was that the ridge, while offering advantages, wasn't particularly strong. The right southern flank was exposed. There was no natural obstacle to prevent the French from sweeping around it. The ridge itself was long enough that defending it fully would spread his forces thin. And the mixture of British, Portuguese, and Spanish troops made coordination difficult. Beresford's initial deployment reflected his uncertainty. He placed Spanish troops under Blake on the right flank, Portuguese in the center, and British regiments in the center and left. This seemed logical. The Spanish held the higher ground on the right, while the British and Portuguese covered the approaches to the village. But this deployment assumed Soult would make a straightforward frontal attack. Soult had other plans. May 16th, 1811, began with fog and tension. Both armies were deployed by dawn, watching each other across a few hundred yards of open ground. Skirmishers, light infantry from both sides, exchanged desultory fire. Artillery crews prepared their guns. Soldiers checked their equipment, tightened straps, and waited for the orders that would send them forward. Soult's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Fix the Allied left and center with a demonstration, then smash into the exposed right flank with overwhelming force. Around 8:00 a.m., French troops began moving toward the village of Albuera and the Allied left. French artillery opened fire. Infantry columns advanced toward the brook. To Beresford, watching from the center of his line, this looked like the main attack, a straightforward assault on his left flank and the village. He began shifting troops to reinforce the left. British and Portuguese units moved north, attention focused on the village approaches. This was exactly what Soult wanted. Meanwhile, concealed by broken ground and morning fog, the bulk of Soult's army, 3 full divisions, perhaps 15,000 men, supported by cavalry and artillery, was swinging wide to the south. They marched in columns parallel to the Allied line, invisible to Beresford's headquarters, aiming to strike the Allied right flank where Spanish troops held the higher ground. The first indication something was wrong came from Spanish outposts around 9:00 a.m. Reports reached Blake that French troops were visible to the south, moving in large numbers. Blake sent word to Beresford. But Beresford, focused on what he believed was the main French attack on his left, initially dismissed these reports. Surely the French wouldn't abandon the obvious approach for a flanking march across difficult terrain. By 9:30 a.m., the truth became undeniable. French columns were deploying on the Allied right in overwhelming numbers. Soult's entire main body was there, preparing to attack uphill but against Spanish troops who'd been positioned to face east, not south. Blake's Spaniards now had to redeploy their entire line by 90 degrees, turning from facing east to facing south, while French artillery began ranging shots and French infantry formed up for assault. This was the moment Beresford's inexperience became potentially catastrophic. A more instinctive commander might have immediately grasped the situation and begun repositioning forces. Beresford hesitated, uncertain whether this was the real attack or another feint. He sent for his British Reserve, Cole's 4th Division, and a brigade under Major General Lowry Cole, but didn't immediately commit them. He rode toward the threatened flank, but without clear orders for a coordinated response. The Spanish troops, meanwhile, were in desperate straits. Blake's men were redeploying under fire, one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. They had to change front while maintaining formation, all while French artillery opened up and French cavalry threatened their flanks. Spanish officers shouted orders. Regiments tried to wheel into new positions. Confusion spread as different units interpreted orders differently. And then, around 10:00 a.m., Soult launched his main assault. 3 French divisions, Girard's, Gazan's, and Werle's, approximately 8,000 to 10,000 infantry plus cavalry and artillery support, surged up the ridge toward the Spanish positions. These weren't disorganized mobs. They advanced in columns, drums beating with their characteristic shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" French artillery on the lower slopes provided covering fire. French cavalry, Polish lancers and hussars threatened the Spanish flanks, ready to exploit any gap. The Spanish fought bravely. They were defending their homeland. Their officers rallied them. They formed lines and delivered volleys into the approaching French columns. For perhaps 30 minutes they held, but the mathematics were brutal. The French had overwhelming numbers at the point of attack. Their columns could absorb casualties and keep coming. Their artillery systematically knocked out Spanish guns. Their cavalry harassed the Spanish flanks. And critically, the Spanish were still partially disorganized from their hasty redeployment. Around 10:30 a.m., the Spanish line began to crack. Individual regiments, overwhelmed by French pressure and taking horrific casualties, started to pull back. Once withdrawal began, it accelerated. The ancient problem of linear tactics is that if one unit breaks, it exposes the flanks of adjacent units, forcing them to fall back or be enveloped. Within minutes, what had been organized resistance became panicked retreat. Spanish soldiers streamed back across the ridge, officers trying desperately to rally them, while French infantry surged forward to exploit the breakthrough. Suddenly, the entire Allied right flank had collapsed. The ridge, the key terrain, was falling into French hands. Soult's gamble had paid off brilliantly. His forces now occupied commanding ground and could roll up the Allied line from south to north. British and Portuguese troops in the center would be caught between the French attack from the east and French forces now descending on them from the south. Beresford's army was in imminent danger of destruction. This was the moment Colonel William Myers faced his impossible choice. Colonel William Myers commanded the 2nd Division's Fusilier Brigade, approximately 2,000 British soldiers in 3 battalions. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 7th Royal Fusiliers and the 1st Battalion of the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers. These were good troops, reasonably experienced, well drilled. They'd been positioned in the Allied center, facing east, waiting for a French attack from that direction. When the Spanish collapsed, Myers received fragmented, confusing orders. The situation was fluid and chaotic. Staff officers galloped past with contradictory information. The sound of battle from the south, where the ridge was falling to the French, made it clear something catastrophic was happening. And then Myers saw them. French infantry, thousands of them, cresting the ridge to his right and rear. They were redeploying from column into line, preparing to sweep north along the ridge and take the entire Allied position from behind. Between Myers's brigade and those French columns lay perhaps 600 yards of open ground. Within minutes, the French would be positioned to pour fire into the British center from the flank and rear. Myers made his decision in seconds. He would wheel his brigade to face south and advance to retake the ridge. This meant marching his men across open ground, under artillery fire, to attack a superior French force that held the high ground. It meant redeploying from line into column for the march, then back into line for the firefight. Complex maneuvers under fire that required perfect discipline. It meant accepting that his brigade would take horrific casualties. But if he didn't move immediately, the battle was lost. The French would consolidate their position and destroy the Allied army piecemeal. Someone had to buy time for the rest of Beresford's force to redeploy. Someone had to contest that ridge. Myers gave the orders. Drums beat the signals for column formation. The Fusilier Brigade began its advance. Simultaneously, Major General William Stewart of the 2nd Division was reaching the same conclusion. Stewart commanded Colborne's brigade, the 31st, 48th, and 66th Regiments, and part of Houghton's brigade, including the 29th and 57th Regiments. These were the troops that would bear the absolute worst of what was coming. Stewart was aggressive, brave to the point of recklessness, and tactically unsophisticated. He saw the French on the ridge, saw the Spanish fleeing, and concluded the British had to attack immediately. He began ordering his brigades forward without careful coordination or clear orders about formation. What happened next has been debated by military historians for 2 centuries. The exact sequence of events is hard to reconstruct. The battle dissolved into chaos. Smoke obscured the field. Different units experienced different timelines. But the essential story is clear. British infantry, roughly 6,000 men in several brigades, began advancing toward a ridge held by perhaps 15,000 French infantry supported by artillery and cavalry. They advanced in column for speed, intending to deploy into line when they reached firing range. The French, seeing them come, prepared to receive them with massed volleys and artillery fire. The British were advancing into a killing ground with no cover, no support, and no realistic hope of success. What they had was discipline, courage, and the desperate hope that somehow they could reach the ridge, deploy into line, and use their superior rate of fire to drive back the French before casualties became unsustainable. It was an enormous gamble. Most professional military observers would have called it suicide, but the alternative was losing the battle without a fight. The time was approximately 11:00 a.m. Rain was falling steadily now, turning the ground to mud. Visibility was terrible. Smoke from musket and artillery fire mixed with rain and fog to create a murky haze. Officers could barely see their own companies, let alone coordinate with adjacent units. The British brigades marched forward into the storm. Imagine you're a private in the 57th Regiment of Foot. You're 19 years old, from Birmingham, enlisted 8 months ago. You've been in Spain for 3 months. You've never been in a major battle. Your hands are shaking as you check your musket for the 10th time, flint tight, powder dry as you can keep it in this ball properly seated. Your sergeant is shouting at you to stay in formation. Around you, the rest of your company is marching in column, 8 files across, moving at the quick step toward the sound of battle you can hear but not see through the smoke. The ground is slippery. You're trying not to stumble. Your pack weighs 60 pounds. Your uniform is soaked through. Rain drips off your shako. You can hear the drums beating the cadence, left, right, mechanical and steady, the sound your body knows from endless hours of drill. Then the first artillery round hits. You don't see where it comes from. There's just a whistling scream and suddenly the man, 3 files to your left, is gone. Literally gone, his body torn apart by the cannonball. Blood sprays across the men around him. Someone is screaming. Your sergeant is bellowing. Close up, close the ranks, keep moving. The column contracts. Men step into the gaps left by casualties. You're still marching. Another round hits. This one bounces through the ranks like a bowling ball, taking legs off 2 men before disappearing into the smoke behind you. The screaming is constant now. You're not sure if you're screaming too. Through gaps in the smoke, you catch glimpses of what's ahead, a slope rising toward a ridgeline, and on that ridgeline, dark masses of French infantry. There are so many of them. How can there be so many? An officer rides past, sword drawn. Steady, lads, steady. When we reach the ridge, deploy into line and give them volley fire. Keep your formation. His horse is wild-eyed, fighting the bit. He disappears forward into the smoke. The artillery fire intensifies. Round shot and case shot, the latter bursting above the column and spraying musket balls down like lethal rain. Men are falling constantly now. You step over bodies. You try not to look at their faces. The column is still advancing. You can see the French more clearly now, maybe 200 yards away. They're in line formation, 3 ranks deep, muskets leveled. There must be thousands of them. Your column is supposed to deploy into line, wheel out from column into the 2-rank line that maximizes firepower, but that takes time and space and coordination. Then the French open fire. The volley is like the sky splitting open. Thousands of muskets discharge simultaneously. The smoke is instantaneous and total. You can't see anything, but you hear the bullets, a sound like tearing cloth, but amplified 1,000 times. Men around you are hit. The front of the column dissolves into screaming chaos. Deploy! Deploy into line! Officers are shouting. Your sergeant grabs you, shoves you to the right. Move, damn you! Form line! 2 ranks! You're trying to obey. Training takes over. You know what to do. You've done it 100 times on the parade ground. But this isn't the parade ground. Bodies are everywhere. The ground is slippery with mud and blood. Men are bunching up, spreading out, trying to find their positions. The company is supposed to form a line 2 ranks deep, with 5-foot intervals between files, but nothing is where it should be. Another French volley. More men fall. You're in line now, roughly. 2nd rank. The man in front of you in the front rank is loading his musket. You can't hear specific orders anymore over the roar of battle. You're loading too. Powder cartridge from Colmar. The pouch. Tear it with your teeth. Taste the bitter powder. Pour it down the barrel. Ball from your mouth where you've been keeping it. Ramrod out. Ram the charge home. Ramrod back in the pipes. Prime the pan with powder. Half-cock the firelock. Present. Wait for the command. Front rank. Fire. The rank in front of you erupts in smoke and thunder. You can't see what they're shooting at. You can't see if they hit anything, but training says the 2nd rank fires after the 1st, so you're ready. 2nd rank, fire! You pull the trigger. The musket slams back into your shoulder. The noise is overwhelming. You're immediately reloading. Muscle memory, the mechanical sequence you've practiced until it's automatic. Bite cartridge. Pour powder, ram ball, prime pan, present. The French are firing back constantly. Bullets are hitting all around you. The man in front of you staggers and falls. You step forward into the front rank. You're supposed to close ranks, maintain the formation. Load, fire, load, fire. The world narrows to this mechanical sequence. Time loses meaning. You might have been firing for 5 minutes or an hour. Your shoulder is bruised from recoil. Your hands are black with powder. Your hearing is gone. Everything is muffled roar. Men are falling constantly. Officers are down. Your sergeant is still alive, screaming orders, but you can't hear the words. Through the smoke, you see French infantry advancing. They're in column, bayonets fixed, coming straight at you. There aren't enough of you left to stop them. Your line is ragged, full of gaps where men have fallen. An officer appears. You don't know who. His uniform is covered in mud and blood. He's pointing his sword at the French. His mouth is moving. You understand the meaning, if not the words. Stand. Hold the line. Don't run. The French are 20 yards away. 10 yards. You fire one more time, barely aiming. And then they hit your line, and it's not formation anymore. It's just chaos. Bayonets and rifle butts, and men stabbing and clubbing. You're using your musket like a club. Someone is trying to stab you with a bayonet. You knock it aside and swing your musket into his face. He goes down. Another Frenchman is there. Everything is instinct and panic and the absolute animal need to survive the next second. And then, somehow, they're falling back. The French column pulls away. You're still alive. Men around you are gasping, crying, reloading frantically. Bodies are everywhere. British and French mixed together. An officer is shouting, "Reform the line! Reload! They'll come again!" You're reloading with shaking hands. You realize you're sobbing. So is the man next to you. You don't know him. Your company has taken so many casualties that you're mixed in with men from other companies, other regiments. But you're both still standing. You're both still loading your muskets, because they will come again. The French are reforming. You can see them through the smoke, officers, rallying them, columns forming up. They have fresh troops, they have reinforcements. Your regiment is half destroyed, and you've been fighting for, you have no idea how long. An NCO grabs your shoulder. "Steady, lad. We hold here. Wellington is coming. We just have to hold." You don't know if Wellington is coming. You don't know anything except that the French are advancing again, and you have to load and fire, until either they break or you do. This was the experience of thousands of British soldiers on that ridge for approximately 3 hours. The timeline is difficult to establish precisely. Survivors gave different accounts, casualties disrupted unit cohesion, smoke obscured the field, but the essential story is consistent across all sources. The British brigades, Myers's Fusiliers, Colborne's brigade, Houghton's brigade, reached the ridge and deployed into line under devastating fire. They traded volleys with superior French numbers at ranges sometimes as close as 30 yards. The French attacked multiple times with columns supported by cavalry and artillery. The British line bent but never quite broke. The fighting was so intense that musket barrels became too hot to touch. Soldiers poured water down barrels to cool them. Men fired until their ammunition was exhausted, then took cartridge boxes from corpses. Officers fought on horseback until their mounts were shot out from under them, then continued on foot. Sergeants held the line together through sheer force of personality, screaming encouragement and threats in equal measure. The casualty rate was catastrophic. The 57th Regiment lost 428 men out of 570, 75% casualties. The Fusilier Brigade suffered over 50% casualties. Colborne's brigade was wrecked. Houghton himself fell, mortally wounded. Company after company was reduced to a handful of men. Color bearers were shot down. New ones stepped forward to grab the flags and were shot down in turn. 15 color bearers from the various regiments fell that day, and yet the line held. Around noon, the situation reached its absolute nadir. The British brigades on the ridge were fought nearly to destruction. French forces outnumbered them dramatically and held superior positions. French cavalry, Polish lancers, had smashed into the flank of one British regiment, riding down soldiers before being driven off by a desperate bayonet charge. Artillery from both sides pounded the contested ground until it was cratered and muddy with blood. Beresford himself rode to the ridge. Accounts describe him fighting personally, pistol in hand, trying to rally troops whose regimental structures had dissolved. At one point, he grabbed the colors of a shattered regiment and waved them to rally survivors. This was brave, but ineffectual. The army needed generalship, not symbolic gestures, and Beresford's command decisions remained hesitant. The French were winning. They were grinding down the British through attrition. Soult committed fresh reserves. French officers could see the Allied line wavering. One more push, they calculated, would break it completely. But then, several factors converged to shift the balance. First, Portuguese troops under Colonel Harvey arrived on the British left flank and deployed into line, extending the Allied position and providing fresh firepower. The Portuguese had been held in reserve and now moved forward with discipline, their British officers directing fire onto French columns. They weren't enough to turn the tide alone, but they stabilized one section of line. Second, artillery from both sides had been battering each other throughout the battle. British artillery, though outnumbered, had taken a severe toll on French infantry at close range, sometimes as little as 300 yards. Artillery loaded with canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with musket balls, was devastating against dense formations. British gunners worked their pieces until barrels were scorching hot, pouring fire into French columns and forcing them to deploy into line, which reduced their shock power. Third, and most importantly, Major General Lowry Cole's 4th Division arrived on the field. Cole had been held in reserve on the Allied left, watching the demonstration there. When reports reached him about the disaster on the right flank, he'd been ordered to march to support. It had taken time, over an hour, to move his division across the battlefield. But around 1 p.m., Cole's brigades began arriving, approximately 5,000 fresh British and Portuguese troops, including the famous Fusilier Brigade and Portuguese infantry. Cole grasped the situation immediately. The ridge was the key. The British regiments there were on the verge of collapse. He had to reinforce them before they broke. Cole deployed his division into line on the lower slopes and began advancing. His troops had been marching through rain and mud but hadn't yet been engaged. They moved forward in good order, drums beating, colors flying. The French, seeing fresh troops arriving, began to waver. They'd been fighting for hours, had taken severe casualties, and expected the British to break. Instead, reinforcements were arriving. French officers tried to rally their men for another attack, but exhaustion and casualties were taking their toll. What happened next has become legendary in British military history. Cole's division advanced up the ridge. They deployed into a line formation, approximately 6,000 muskets strong, and closed to within 50 yards of the French position. At that range, every shot counted. The British fired by volley, entire battalions discharging simultaneously in a rippling thunder that seemed to shake the ground. The French returned fire. For perhaps 20 minutes, the two lines stood almost face to face, trading volleys in what survivors described as the most intense firefight they'd ever experienced. Men loaded and fired as fast as humanly possible. The smoke became so thick that neither side could see the other. They simply fired into the murk where the enemy had been seconds before. The casualty rate in those 20 minutes was obscene. Men fell in clusters, entire files were swept away by volleys, officers were targeted by sharpshooters and fell in disproportionate numbers. Sergeants stepped up to command companies. Junior officers took over battalions. But the British rate of fire, 3 volleys per minute when possible, began to tell. The 2-rank line meant every musket could engage. Drill and discipline held even when visibility dropped to yards, and the arrival of fresh troops gave the British a psychological edge. This wasn't a last stand anymore. This was a fight they might win. Around 1:30 p.m., the French line broke. It didn't happen all at once. Individual regiments, battered beyond endurance, began pulling back. Once withdrawal started, it rippled along the line. French officers tried to stop it, but their troops were fought out. They'd been attacking uphill against disciplined infantry for hours. Their casualties were enormous. They'd expected British collapse and instead found resistance that seemed to intensify. The British didn't pursue immediately. They were too exhausted, too disorganized, too decimated by casualties. But they held the ridge. They'd stopped Soult's attack. The crisis had passed. As the French infantry pulled back, another drama unfolded. A cavalry action that would be remembered as one of the most effective and tragic of the Peninsular War. British cavalry in the Peninsula had a mixed reputation. They were brave, well-mounted, and individually skilled. But they also had a tendency toward excessive aggression, charging without orders, pursuing too far, getting separated and cut down by formed infantry. Wellington had famously complained that British cavalry gallop at everything and couldn't be controlled once launched. At Albuera, the heavy brigade under Major General William Lumley was positioned on the Allied left. This brigade included the 3rd Dragoon Guards and the 4th Dragoons, big men on big horses equipped with heavy sabers and intended to charge formed infantry. They'd been waiting throughout the battle, watching the infantry fight on the ridge, held in reserve for the moment when they could decisively intervene. As French infantry withdrew from the ridge, they were disordered, exhausted, and vulnerable. This was the moment for cavalry to exploit. Lumley ordered a charge. The heavy brigade, approximately 600 men, formed up and began trotting forward. The trot became a canter, then a gallop. They thundered up the slope toward retreating French columns. The ground was muddy, littered with bodies and equipment, but the horses plunged forward. They struck the French infantry with devastating effect. Cavalry crashing into disordered infantry is a nightmare scenario for the infantry. Horses weighing half a ton moving at 20 miles per hour, sabers swinging down from above, the sheer psychological terror of mounted men. The French columns tried to form squares, the defensive formation against cavalry, but were too disorganized. The British cavalry smashed through. Accounts describe the carnage. Sabers cutting down infantry, horses trampling fallen men, French soldiers trying to surrender or flee. The British cavalry pursued, cutting down hundreds. They captured French artillery pieces, the ultimate trophy. They rode through multiple French units, scattering them, and then they went too far. Drunk on success, elements of the heavy brigade pursued beyond the main French position. They were now isolated, deep in enemy-controlled territory, with their horses blown from the charge and climb. French reserves, including Polish lancers, counterattacked. The British cavalry suddenly found themselves surrounded by fresh enemy cavalry and infantry. The lancers were particularly deadly. Lances gave them reach advantage over sabers, and they were skilled at targeting isolated horsemen. British dragoons were pulled from their horses and killed. Those who tried to withdraw found their exhausted horses couldn't outrun fresh French mounts. The heavy brigade lost approximately 30% of its strength, nearly 200 men, most of them in the pursuit phase after the initial successful charge. Officers who'd led the charge fell in the withdrawal. The brigade limped back to Allied lines, bloodied but having accomplished its mission. The French infantry had been broken, the ridge was secure, and Soult's attack had failed. It was approximately 2 p.m. The battle had raged for roughly 5 hours. Both armies were fought to exhaustion. By 3 p.m., fighting had largely ceased. Neither army was capable of continued offensive action. Both sides held their positions, the British on the ridge, the French on lower ground to the south and east, and simply tried to recover. The battlefield looked like a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay in windows where volleys had struck. The ridge itself was carpeted with dead and wounded from both armies. Survivors described being unable to walk 10 feet without stepping over a corpse. The rain had turned the ground into bloody mud. Wounded men cried out for water, for help, for their mothers. Surgeons worked in field hospitals, usually just cleared areas behind the lines, amputating shattered limbs by the dozen, their aprons soaked with blood. The casualty figures tell the story. British losses: approximately 4,159 out of roughly 7,000 engaged, a 60% casualty rate. Portuguese losses: approximately 389. Spanish losses: approximately 1,068. Total Allied casualties: approximately 5,116. French losses: approximately 7,000 to 8,000. Estimates vary. French records were less complete. These numbers deserve unpacking. The British casualty rate was catastrophic by any standard. Individual regiments suffered even worse. The 57th Regiment's 75% casualty rate has never been exceeded by a British regiment in a single day. The Fusilier Brigade lost over half its strength. Officers were killed or wounded in extraordinary numbers. Leadership casualties approached 50% in some units. The dead included Lieutenant Colonel William Ingram Myers, the officer who'd made the initial decision to advance against the French-held ridge. He'd been shot leading his men and died on the field. Major General Daniel Houghton, commanding a brigade, had been mortally wounded. Dozens of company and field officers fell. The casualty rate among ensigns and color bearers, junior officers carrying the regimental flags, was particularly severe because these men were conspicuous targets. The French suffered heavily too, but their losses were spread across a larger force. Proportionally, their casualty rate was lower, but they'd lost experienced veterans, officers who couldn't be easily replaced, and critically, they'd lost their momentum. Soult's plan had been to destroy Beresford's army and relieve Badajoz. Instead, he'd been fought to a standstill by an army he outnumbered. Beresford wrote his official dispatch that evening in a state of profound depression. His initial report to Wellington was so gloomy, emphasizing losses and near disaster rather than victory, that Wellington reportedly rewrote portions of it before forwarding to London. Beresford had technically won. He held the field, the French withdrew. The siege of Badajoz could potentially resume. But the cost had been so high and the margin of victory so narrow that it felt like defeat. For the soldiers who survived, there was no sense of triumph, only exhausted relief. They'd stood on that ridge for hours, firing until their ammunition was gone, watching comrades die and somehow not broken. But the experience had been traumatic in ways that veterans struggled to articulate. Private John Cooper of the 7th Fusiliers wrote later, "I have been in several actions, but I never witnessed anything like Albuera. The ground was so covered with dead that it was difficult to move without treading on them. Many of our men wept when they saw what the regiment had suffered." The burial details worked for days. Bodies were buried in mass graves. There was no time or manpower for individual burials. French and British dead were often buried together. The smell was overwhelming. The task was emotionally devastating, especially identifying dead comrades and going through their effects to send letters and personal items home to families. The wounded faced a different horror. Medical care in 1811 was primitive. Surgeons could amputate limbs, the standard treatment for any severe arm or leg wound, but had limited ability to treat internal injuries, head wounds, or shock. Anesthesia didn't exist beyond alcohol and opium. Men were held down while surgeons sawed through bone. The survival rate for major surgery was perhaps 50%. Infection killed many who survived the initial procedure. Regimental strengths dropped catastrophically. The 57th Regiment could field perhaps 140 effectives out of the 570 who'd begun the battle. Other regiments were similarly shattered. It would take months to rebuild these units with reinforcements from England. Some regiments never fully recovered their effectiveness. For Soult, the battle was a strategic defeat despite tactical near success. He'd failed to relieve Badajoz. His army was too battered to renew the attack. After several days of confrontation, he withdrew south, leaving Badajoz to its fate. The fortress would fall to Wellington later that year after a bloody siege. But the true significance of Albuera went beyond immediate calculations of casualties and territorial control. First, Albuera demonstrated that British infantry could defeat French veterans even in the most disadvantageous circumstances. Previous British victories in the peninsula, Vimero, Talavera, Busaco, had been won on carefully chosen defensive ground with Wellington personally commanding. Albuera was different. Poor initial deployment, mediocre generalship, surprise flanking attack, forced to fight in the worst possible circumstances. And yet British infantry had held. This had profound psychological effects on both armies. French confidence, the assumption that aggressive attacks would break coalition forces, took a severe blow. British confidence, conversely, increased. Soldiers who survived Albuera knew they could stand against anything. Second, Albuera validated British tactical doctrine. The two-rank line, the emphasis on drill and rate of fire, the willingness to trust in discipline over élan, all had worked even when conditions were nightmarish. Critics had questioned whether British methods could prevail against French columns in fluid battle conditions. Albuera answered, yes, if the soldiers held their nerve. Third, Albuera had strategic implications for the entire Peninsular War. Soult's failure meant Badajoz remained under siege and eventually fell to the British. This opened southern Spain to Allied operations. The French never regained the initiative in that theater. By 1812, Wellington would advance into Spain proper, eventually driving the French back to the Pyrenees. Albuera was a crucial step in that progression. It prevented French reconquest of Portugal and demonstrated that Allied forces could fight major actions without Wellington personally present. Fourth, Albuera consumed French resources and morale. The 7,000, 8,000 casualties were men Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. By 1811, he was preparing for the Russian campaign that would launch in 1812. Every veteran lost in Spain was one less soldier available for Russia. The cumulative effect of battles like Albuera, not decisively crushing defeats, but grinding attritional fights that cost both sides heavily but prevented French strategic success, was to bleed the Grande Armée white. Spain became the Spanish ulcer, not through any single disaster, but through endless combat that consumed men and resources without producing victory. Fifth, the battle revealed both the strengths and limits of coalition warfare. British, Portuguese, and Spanish troops fought together, but coordination was difficult. Language barriers, different tactical doctrines, and varying levels of training created friction. The Spanish collapse that triggered the crisis was partly a consequence of these problems. Yet the Portuguese fought superbly, and the ultimate victory depended on Allied cooperation. Wellington and his staff learned lessons about integrating multinational forces that would prove valuable in later campaigns. Sixth, Albuera demonstrated the resilience of British military culture. The army that fought at Albuera included many raw recruits led by middling officers, commanded by a general with limited battlefield instinct. Yet it won through the courage and discipline of individual soldiers who refused to break despite every rational reason to flee. This wasn't unique to Albuera. British military history is full of similar examples, but it's worth considering why. Drill created muscle memory that functioned even in extremity. The regimental system created unit cohesion and identity that made soldiers fight for comrades even when cause seemed lost. Officers who led from the front earned the respect that made men follow them into hell. These weren't accidents. They were the products of deliberate military culture. So why has Albuera faded from popular memory while battles like Waterloo remain famous? First, the complexity barrier. Albuera is hard to understand without extensive context. You need to grasp the Peninsular War's strategic situation, the siege of Badajoz, the coalition dynamics, Soult's career, Beresford's limitations. Waterloo is conceptually simple. Napoleon's final battle, good versus evil, clear outcome. Albuera is messier, a battle fought by a substitute commander, part of a long campaign with ambiguous tactical success despite strategic importance. Popular history favors simplicity. Second, not the decisive moment. Albuera didn't end the Peninsular War or destroy a French army. It was one battle in a 6-year campaign. Waterloo ended Napoleon's career. Trafalgar secured British naval supremacy. Albuera prevented a French strategic success and enabled future operations. That's important, but not dramatic. History remembers knockout blows more than defensive stands that prevent defeat. Third, overshadowed by Wellington. Wellington fought no major battles in May 1811. He was conducting the siege of Badajoz and monitoring the northern frontier. Albuera was fought by his subordinate. Wellington's later victories, Salamanca, Vitoria, Toulouse, captured public attention. His genius as a commander became the Peninsular War's dominant narrative. Battles fought by other commanders, even victories, got relegated to footnotes. Fourth, the horror factor. Albuera was so costly that even contemporary observers struggled with it. The key, 60% British casualty rate, the images of ridges carpeted with dead, the regiments reduced to remnants. These were disturbing rather than glorious. Victorian Britain liked its military history triumphant and heroic. Albuera was heroic, certainly, but also nightmarish. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about war. Fifth, geographic and temporal distance. For British audiences, the Peninsular War was remote, fighting in Spain and Portugal, while Napoleon threatened closer to home. The time gap matters too. Albuera was fought 4 years before Waterloo. By the time the Napoleonic Wars ended, Albuera had been superseded by more recent battles. Popular memory is short. Sixth, limited cultural legacy. Waterloo inspired paintings, novels, poems. Albuera got regimental memorials and military histories. There's no Albuera painting equivalent to Scotland Forever or The Thin Red Line. No major literary work centers on it. Pop culture ignores it. Without cultural reinforcement, historical events fade. Seventh, the uncomfortable truth about generalship. Albuera was won despite Beresford's command failures, not because of brilliant leadership. British military historians don't love emphasizing instances where soldiers succeeded despite their generals. It complicates the narrative of tactical genius. Albuera forces acknowledgement that sometimes courage matters more than strategy. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten Albuera. It appears in every serious study of the Peninsular War. Regimental histories treasure it. The 57th Regiment's museum devotes significant space to explaining what happened that day. Military analysts study it as an example of infantry combat at its most intense and a case study in unit cohesion under maximum stress. Charles Oman, the definitive historian of the Peninsular War, wrote, "The Battle of Albuera was perhaps the bloodiest fight in all the annals of the Peninsular War. It was won by the sheer stubborn courage of the British infantry, who refused to acknowledge defeat even when military logic suggested they should break." Sir John Fortescue, historian of the British Army, called it the most desperate struggle in which British troops have ever been engaged. Modern military historians recognize Albuera as crucial to understanding why Britain prevailed in the peninsula. It demonstrated that British methods could succeed even in the worst tactical situations, provided the soldiers maintained discipline. It validated the investment in drill and training. It proved that Wellington's system worked even when Wellington himself wasn't present. Let's return to that private from Birmingham, the 19-year-old recruit we imagined earlier. Somehow, he survived. The battle ended, the French withdrew, and he was still alive. Around him lay most of his company, friends he'd trained with, marched with, shared rations with, dead or wounded. In the days after the battle, he helped bury the dead. He wrote a letter home, trying to explain what had happened, but finding words inadequate. He got drunk on looted French brandy and cried. He experienced nightmares, the sound of bullets, the faces of Frenchmen he'd killed, the screaming. In modern terms, he had PTSD, though no one knew to call it that. But he also experienced something else, the knowledge that he'd stood. When everything in his body screamed to run, he'd stayed in line and fought. When comrades fell and the situation seemed hopeless, he'd reloaded his musket and kept firing. He'd discovered reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed. This isn't glorifying war. War is horror. The soldiers at Albuera experienced trauma that stayed with them for life. Many were physically maimed. All were psychologically scarred. The cost was terrible and real, but within that horror, they achieved something extraordinary. They faced the Grande Armée's finest infantry in the worst possible circumstances and refused to break. They demonstrated that courage isn't the absence of fear. Everyone was terrified, but the ability to function despite fear. They proved that training, discipline, and unit cohesion can enable ordinary people to perform extraordinarily under maximum stress. The officers who led them, Myers, Houghton, Cole, and countless company commanders whose names are recorded only in regimental rolls, understood they were asking soldiers to do something that might kill them. They led from the front, exposing themselves to the same fire they asked their men to endure. Many died for it. Their example mattered. Soldiers will follow officers they trust into situations they'd otherwise flee. The sergeants and corporals who held the line together literally grabbing men and shoving them back into formation, who maintained fire discipline when chaos reigned, who kept their sections fighting when every instinct said run. These NCOs were the unsung heroes. British military effectiveness depended on these experienced soldiers who knew their craft and could execute under pressure. And the common soldiers, the teenagers from Birmingham and Manchester, the farm boys from Yorkshire, the unemployed weavers from Scotland. They were the ones who actually stood on that ridge for 3 hours and traded fire with French veterans. They were the ones who reloaded while cannonballs tore through their ranks. They were the ones who faced bayonet charges and held. They were the ones who died at 75% casualty rates without breaking. What enabled this? Several factors combined. Training created automaticity. In extremity, conscious thought shuts down. Soldiers at Albuera didn't think about what to do. They executed drills they'd practiced thousands of times. Loading and firing became automatic. Responding to commands became reflexive. This is why armies drill endlessly, to create muscle memory that functions when fear overwhelms cognition. Unit cohesion mattered enormously. Soldiers fought for each other, not abstract causes. The man next to you had shared your tent, your rations, your jokes. You couldn't abandon him. British regiments cultivated this deliberately. Companies recruited from the same regions. Men served together for years. Shared identities formed. At Albuera, men literally died rather than let down their comrades. Leadership provided anchor points. When everything was chaos, soldiers looked to officers and sergeants for cues. If leaders remained calm, or faked calm convincingly, soldiers stayed steadier. When officers led charges personally, men followed. When sergeants maintained discipline, sections held together. Leadership wasn't abstract. It was personal and immediate. Peer pressure enforced behavior. Running was shameful. Standing was expected. Social conditioning, centuries of military culture that valorized courage and stigmatized cowardice, meant soldiers feared shame more than bullets. This sounds harsh, but it functioned. Men stood partially because they couldn't bear the thought of being seen as cowards. Lack of alternatives helped paradoxically. Once engaged, retreat was often as dangerous as standing. Turning your back to the enemy and running invited being shot down. Standing in formation, at least you could fight back. Sometimes the least bad option is to keep fighting. Human resilience is remarkable. People can endure astonishing punishment. Soldiers at Albuera kept fighting despite wounds, exhaustion, and trauma that should have incapacitated them. Adrenaline, shock, and sheer determination enabled them to function. The human capacity to persist in extremity shouldn't be underestimated. None of this makes war good or desirable. Albuera was tragedy as much as triumph. But understanding why those soldiers stood helps us comprehend human capability under pressure. It reminds us that ordinary people, given training and leadership and motivation, can accomplish things that seem impossible. The 57th Regiment of Foot's experience at Albuera became central to their identity. Out of 570 officers and men who entered battle that morning, only 142 answered roll call that evening. They'd lost 428 casualties, 75% of their strength. No British regiment before or since has suffered such losses in a single day and maintained cohesion. The regiment's colors, the flags carried into battle as rallying points, became symbols of that sacrifice. 15 men carried the colors at different points during the battle. Each picked up the flags when the previous bearer fell. The colors themselves were shredded by bullets. The poles splintered, but they never fell to the ground. When the battle ended, they were so tattered they could barely be recognized as flags. After the battle, the regiment received the nickname the Diehards. This came from the dying words of their colonel, William Ingram, who was shot leading the line. According to legend and regimental tradition, as he lay dying, Ingram shouted, "Die hard! 57th, die hard!" Whether he actually said this, or whether surviving officers created the phrase afterward, is unclear. But it captured the regiment's ethos perfectly. They became the Die Hard Regiment, and Die Hard became their unofficial motto. The regiment rebuilt. Reinforcements arrived from England. Officers promoted from the ranks filled gaps. By late 1811, the 57th was back in action. They fought through the rest of the Peninsular War, at Vittoria and other battles. They carried Albuera with them. Survivors told new recruits about the ridge, about standing against impossible odds, about what the regiment could endure. After the Napoleonic Wars, the 57th continued service across the British Empire. They fought in India, Afghanistan, South Africa. They were at the relief of Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny. They served in both world wars. Through reorganizations and amalgamations, eventually becoming part of the Middlesex Regiment, they maintained connection to Albuera. Veterans associations held commemorations. Regimental museums preserved artifacts, tattered colors, uniforms, weapons, letters from survivors. The other regiments that fought at Albuera maintained similar traditions. The Royal Fusiliers, the 48th Regiment, the 29th, each preserved Albuera's memory through their own regimental culture. Colors were laid up in churches with battle honors embroidered. Albuera, alongside Waterloo, Peninsula, and dozens of others. Regimental silver bore inscriptions. Formal dinners included toasts to fallen comrades. This might seem like militaristic nostalgia, but it served purpose, maintaining institutional memory, honoring sacrifice, and reinforcing values of courage and unit cohesion. Soldiers joining these regiments learned they were inheriting traditions forged in places like Albuera. They learned that the regiment had stood when standing seemed impossible, and they were expected to uphold that standard. Modern British regiments, after numerous consolidations and reorganizations, still trace lineage back to units that fought at Albuera. The Rifles, formed from multiple regiments, includes elements that descend from Albuera battalions. Veterans of recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan served in units that honor Albuera colors in their museums. The connection is real. Same institution, same values, different era. What can we learn from Albuera beyond military history? First, courage is contextual and cultivated. The soldiers who stood on that ridge weren't born brave. They were teenagers from industrial cities, farm boys, unemployed workers. What made them capable of extraordinary courage was training, leadership, and unit culture. This suggests courage isn't purely innate. It can be developed through preparation and social structure. Second, institutions matter for human performance. The British Army's regimental system, its emphasis on drill, its leadership culture, its rituals and traditions, these weren't window dressing. They created conditions where soldiers could function in extremity. Institutions that invest in training, culture, and leadership enable their members to perform beyond individual capability. Third, sometimes defensive stands matter more than brilliant offense. Albuera wasn't won by tactical genius. It was won by refusing to lose. In life and organizations, sometimes the crucial victory is simply not breaking under pressure. Staying functional when circumstances are terrible. Maintaining coherence when everything pushes toward collapse. This is less dramatic than decisive offensive action, but often more important. Fourth, small groups within larger organizations carry disproportionate weight. The regiments on that ridge were a fraction of the Allied army, but their stand determined the battle's outcome. In any large organization, small teams facing critical challenges can be decisive. Investing in those teams, their training, their cohesion, their leadership, pays disproportionate returns. Fifth, human cost is real and must be acknowledged. Albuera's casualty rates were catastrophic. Even in victory, the human price was terrible. Any discussion of courage and achievement must be balanced with recognition of cost. The soldiers who died weren't abstractions. They were individuals with families, hopes, futures cut short. Honoring their courage means acknowledging their sacrifice, not glorifying death. Sixth, memory and commemoration serve functions. Keeping Albuera's story alive in regimental museums, military histories, commemorations isn't just nostalgia. It preserves lessons about courage, sacrifice, and institutional values. It honors people who deserve remembering. It provides examples for future challenges. Memory is how we carry forward what others achieved. Seventh, sometimes the impossible becomes possible through collective will. 6,000 soldiers held against overwhelming numbers because each individual chose to stand. No one of them could have done it alone. Their collective choice, made moment by moment through fear and exhaustion and trauma, achieved what should have been impossible. This speaks to human capability when people commit to shared purpose despite terrible circumstances. In the end, Albuera deserves to be remembered not because it was the biggest battle or the most tactically brilliant, but because it revealed something essential about what humans can endure and achieve. Remember May 16, 1811, when young soldiers from Britain's industrial cities stood on a muddy Spanish ridge and refused to break despite every rational reason to flee. Remember William Ingram Myers deciding in seconds to advance against impossible odds because someone had to contest that ridge. Remember the 15 color bearers who fell one after another, each picking up the flag because it couldn't be allowed to touch the ground. Remember the 428 men of the 57th Regiment who became casualties but whose survivors kept fighting. Remember the Portuguese who steadied the line, the Spanish who fought despite their earlier collapse, the cavalry who charged when it mattered, the artillery crews who worked their guns until barrels glowed hot. Remember that battles are won not by brilliant strategy alone, but by the courage of soldiers who stand when standing seems futile. Remember that leadership means exposing yourself to the same fire you ask others to endure. Remember that training and discipline and unit cohesion aren't abstract concepts, but the difference between holding and breaking. Remember that sometimes the crucial victory is simply refusing to lose. Remember that the British casualties, 4,059 killed and wounded, weren't numbers but individuals. Each represented a person, someone's son, brother, husband, friend. Each had a life before that ridge and, for many, no life after. Their courage is inseparable from their suffering. Both must be remembered. Remember that Marshal Soult, for all his experience and tactical skill, learned that British infantry properly led and determined to stand were nearly unbreakable. Remember that Wellington's army, despite his absence from this particular battle, embodied his principles. Choose your ground, trust your soldiers, and refuse to be intimidated by superior numbers. Remember that Albuera changed the Peninsular War's trajectory. It prevented French reconquest of Portugal, enabled the capture of Badajoz, and demonstrated that Allied forces could win major engagements without Wellington personally commanding. It was a crucial step in the campaign that would eventually drive the French from Spain entirely and contribute to Napoleon's ultimate defeat. Remember that sometimes at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. If Myers hadn't advanced, if the Fusilier Brigade hadn't held, if Cole's division hadn't arrived, if the Heavy Brigade hadn't charged, any single failure could have meant Allied defeat. The battle was won by a chain of decisions and actions by people who chose courage when circumstances invited despair. The soldiers who fought at Albuera didn't think they were making history. They thought they were trying to survive the next minute. They loaded and fired because that's what training said to do. They stood beside their comrades because they couldn't bear to abandon them. They followed officers because those men led from the front. They held the line because breaking seemed more shameful than dying. And through those individual choices, repeated thousands of times across 3 terrible hours, they achieved something that military historians still struggle to fully explain. Outnumbered, Caught by surprise, poorly commanded, they stood against Napoleon's finest and prevailed. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. Not to glorify war, Albuera was horror, not glory, but to understand what humans can endure, what courage actually means, and what we are capable of when everything depends on standing firm. May 16th, 1811. Ridge in southern Spain. 6,000 British soldiers against overwhelming odds. They stood, they fought, they held, and they changed the course of a war. Die hard, 57th. Die hard. They did. And because they did, Spain was saved, the peninsula secured, and Napoleon's grip on Europe weakened. Sometimes standing your ground when standing seems impossible is how history's course changes. This is Albuera. This is why it matters. This is why we remember.